All right, we'll have a swap over here. I think the next panel is Chutes and Ladders. This was a request from a board member of Oyster South. Is Jody in the room? Did she make it this morning? All right. I know that Jody felt that different states have had different levels of success with promoting shellfish aquaculture. So if my panelists could come up, I think Chris, you're back up, right? That panelists can come on up. We'll get this started. All right. So, you could ask how do you choose these states? So obviously we looked at states. This was Eric, if you read the program, Eric Herbst from North Carolina and I were tasked to put together the panel, and we started talking about what states have had a lot of shellfish farm growth. But then you also had to look at who you could reasonably get to the meeting. So we know that we don't have a complete cast of all the states that have grown their industry, but we do have this distinguished panel. And did I put up individual pictures? So I'm the guy, the second Christmas hat there, the one next to Beth. And I'm going to talk about, even though I'm in Virginia, I'm going to talk about what worked in Alabama because of my time there. Holden here is a Holden Davanzo. Yeah, I got that. She sent me the picture. Anchored Life Oyster Farm is going to talk about what worked in North Carolina. Keith Butterfield's here from Maine, and he's Butterfield Shellfish. Are going to talk about what has worked in Maine. And Amanda Carr, Plochet and Carr. I got it right the second time. And she's going to talk about what's worked primarily in Washington. And then Chris Smith is from Objak Bay. You just heard about him on the nursery panel. He's going to talk about what's worked in Virginia. So I thought I would start it off the moderator privilege, I guess. And so when I look at this, Alabama, when I started in 2009, we were like, all right, like we've got Stephen D. McCrockett, we've got a farm. And from the beginning, we were like, we want this to be a commercial farm. This is not an experiment. We are asking for a permit for a commercial farm. And okay. And then the year they started selling oysters, it was like, whoa, you're selling oysters? And it was just very frustrating. We did a training program with the folks at AUSL. We put together a training program, and we had a bunch of people interested. And the permitting process, it was interesting hearing the morning panel talking about permitting. It's not just how long it takes to me. It's a question of certainty. If it's 18 months in Texas, but you're fairly certain that you'll be able to check the boxes, I can plan that business, right? If it's 2 years and I'm not sure, like Chris Head was talking about Alabama, if you're investing 2 years time and money and you're not sure if you're probably going to get a yes at the end, that changes the whole dynamics of whether you do it. And I felt like we had a lot of growers that were stuck going in circles because they would go to one agency and that agency would say, go to the other agency first. You got to talk to them. And that other agency would say, no, we need to hear from that other agency. And it would just go in these circles. So we looked at Maryland at the time. And if you haven't looked up the MARBIDCO, I couldn't get that going in Alabama, so I'm not going to talk about that. But it was low interest, industry-friendly loans. Google it. It's an interesting model if you could get somebody to give you some money to start that in your state. But I am going to talk about the Governor's Commission in Aquaculture. And so somebody from what we call Department of Ag and Industries in Alabama offered to help. They said, this looks like a problem. We'd like to have shellfish aquaculture. We'd like to have oyster farming in Alabama. What do you need? And we literally took the wording from Maryland, crossed out where it said Maryland, and put in Alabama pretty much. Like it was pretty straightforward, cut and paste, and with the blessing of Don Webster at Maryland. And I know you probably, but so basically the language, it created a shellfish aquaculture review board, blah, blah, blah. The important part at the end is it got a group together and they had to respond to each other and report to the governor. That was important. That governor reporting thing was critical. And so we had all the state agencies on there. We had somebody from Auburn, Alabama Cooperative Extension. I like magically got listed on that list. And then 2 members from the industry. And importantly, that group then made sure that some of the federal folks were at the table too. Like, if we're going to have a meeting, let's get them all together. From that, I'm not saying it's easy in Alabama, but it streamlined it. And a number of oyster farms really started to increase because the rules were clear, the process was clear. Just that question of, this agency told me I go to you, but you told me to go, like just being able to say that in a room with people, that was embarrassed. Like I don't want to say they were embarrassed, but it was just like, well, that we've got to solve that. It was very simple once people were made to go into the same room. We got new regulations specific to aquaculture. We moved away, probably in some of your states. We defaulted to all the oyster fishery rules, which don't always make sense for aquaculture. So we saw some changes in that. And that ongoing group, Scott Glenn, I think that's met a couple times since when there have been issues. That group has still met, I think, to sometimes deal with issues. So that governor's council was one. The other time I want to use for my time, I want to give a plug for Sea Grant. I'm not saying that oyster aquaculture in Alabama and the Gulf exists because of Sea Grant, but I think you can make a case it would not exist without it. And what I mean by that, I know there are Sea Grant programs everywhere in each coastal state, but boy, Sea Grant for this, Mississippi, Alabama made an investment. They wanted to test 4 different culture methods. We did that. Then National Sea Grant came in. John Supan and I did training programs. They funded that. And it was demonstration. That was that oyster farming park idea. There were some production challenges. People started growing stuff. They had mudworms. They had mortality. They had issues with their different stuff. Sea Grant funded that research. It was applied research that we were able to do. There were regulatory challenges. I mentioned the first fees. I think, Rusty, I can't remember. I think it was $4,000 an acre a year was the initial fee, something like that. And we were like, that's a lot of money. And we got that down. We did that study, and before the study was even finished, we got it down to $250 an acre, something like that, partly just because it was being discussed. Resubmergence requirements, if you air dry your oysters, FDA looks at that and they're like, that's time temperature abuse, and they're probably right. Initially, they said, well, if you air dry your oysters, you're gonna have to resubmerge them for 30 days. If you resubmerge your oysters for 30 days in Mississippi Sound, you might as well not have ever air dried them because they're going to be covered in everything. We got that down to 2 weeks and 1 week, depending on the gear. And I think that may vary in some of other states. There were marketing challenges. You saw Dan Petrolia give a talk earlier. He did a study of some of the consumer perceptions about branded Gulf oysters. We did a training program for servers developed with Auburn University. And then, believe it or not, National Sea Grant funded the first Oyster South Symposium, and the peer-to-peer program was Sea Grant money. All right. I'm just saying they bit into this and they didn't let go. Like they persisted with it. And it would have been easy. Sometimes you go for funding and the researcher and the funding agency move on to the next thing. This was something that you kept going back to them and you made a case that you were building something and they kept supporting it. I will say just these weren't fundings, but Sea Grant agents across the Southeast and Gulf have responded to things like hurricanes, harmful algal blooms, and COVID, and those are Sea Grant agents. So I'm just putting that up there because I know like there will be concerns about government staffing and thinking about what gets funded and what not. And I just want you, without being political here, I just want you to think about if that has helped your business, then you might want to think about if that comes up when if you see a legislator, I would argue that your Sea Grant agent and your Sea Grant program is something that's probably worth supporting. So I will end with that, and I'll hand it over to Chris here.
All right. Well, thank you to Bill and Beth and everyone at Oyster South for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak with you today. Like I said, my name's Chris Smith. I'm the operations manager with Mobjack Bay in Virginia. And we have been farming oysters in Virginia since the early 2000s. And so let's see here, figure out which slide I wanted to talk. There we go. I wanted to actually start at the end of my presentation. What policies in Virginia have helped spur growth in aquaculture? And I wanted to talk actually first about the way we can get bottom leases and permit gear. So in Virginia, you can apply for a bottom lease. Anyone in the state can do it. It usually takes about 6 months. If it's protested, it might take a year. It costs $1.50 per acre. You can apply for up to 250 acres in any one lease. This has been going on, people have been transplanting shells in Virginia, planting extensively for hundreds of years. With that bottom lease, which is a relatively straightforward application, that covers any aquaculture gear up to 12 inches off of the bottom. So not floating gear, but bottom cages, with low profile, rack and bag, anything like that. With a bottom lease, by right, you are permitted to do that. You don't need any additional permitting. You don't need to report how much gear it is. You're good to go, basically. So I did want to kind of lead off with that. There's a that permitting process is very friendly towards business. Now I'm going to rewind. Cool. So very quickly, shellfish growers in Virginia, like many states, or probably all states, are regulated by many different bodies. But I did want to focus here on the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, or MRC, as they have probably the largest influence on what we do as growers. So what kind of big picture policies have helped guide, helped growth of aquaculture? Like I said earlier, growing oysters has been occurring in Virginia for many, many years. We have a culture of culture. There's a long history of seed transplants on private bottom in Virginia. It should be noted this history of production has no effect on NIMBY behavior. That's still very, very prevalent. But there is a long-standing regulatory framework for these activities. And just kind of as evidence of that, if you look at that dotted line on the graph there, going back to the late 1800s, that's the beginning of the private leasing system in Virginia. Second aspect of policy that has aided aquaculture is every application is judged on its merits. Provided you fill out the paperwork right, MRC staff does not approve or deny any applications. The commissioner of MRC does. And in the case of applications that are met with opposition, a hearing in front of the Marine Resources Commission happens, and you have the ability to make your case. Which brings me to the third point, which is that the commissioner and the 8 commission members are all political appointees. Obviously, this has the potential to be a double-edged sword. But the members of the commission, which is the body that is deliberating on applications, they're drawn from groups that have a stake in the management of state waters. So that includes representatives who are involved in aquaculture and wild fisheries, shipbuilding industry, and those commission members serve for a set period of time. So there's everyone has buy-in, and also those seats are always turning over. So that's kind of the quick version of what's going on in Virginia. Thanks.
Going to start, or yes, in 2022, sorry, 2015 is where this is going to start. So I went back 10 years. We had 292 leases in North Carolina, and the state started changing some things. We could now have a 10-year lease instead of a 5-year lease, so we didn't have to go through the renewal process quite so often and change everything. You could really invest in your farm. We also are now allowed to put our bottom cages about 18 inches off of the bottom. I think I killed it. Oh, okay. That's all right. And so a lot of these changes came about with the government agencies. I have it on my phone. The University of Wilmington and the Division of Marine Fisheries were given $450,000 to create revenue in North Carolina to help some of this process. And NOAA granted $450,000 to Carteret Community College and Sea Grant and University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And so that helped a lot of students learn, especially at Carteret Community College. They were able to take this class, and they had to do a mock leasing project and learn how to create their own lease and go through that whole lease process. And it helped the state learn how to streamline this process. So if they could teach a student how to do it, then it would make it a lot easier for us to go in and say, oh, this is how we do it. And they had originally, I wrote it on my hand too. They, as of 2023, they had 107 students go through this class, and 37 have gone on to open up their own lease. And I'm not sure how successful all of those students are, but it's hard work. But North Carolina, I think with the support of the government, as well as the education that they're giving the community, it's not just the oyster farmer educating everybody and saying, hey, we want to be in your backyard. The state is doing it. They're doing living shoreline projects. They're doing culch planning sites. And they're using that grant money to do all of that. So I think it's very helpful in North Carolina. I think.
Okay, the Philippine Oyster Aquaculture 3 graph
think that one was the 2023. Okay, yeah. So I was just kind of comparing from that website. And then we have the picture of all of us together. That was an event done through Carteret Community College for NC State and a lot of local oyster farmers. We all came together to do this, and it was for the mariculture department, I think, of NC State. So, and that's Sea Grants in there. So, I mean, that's, like, we all work together. There really isn't any competition. We have to band together, or it can't fall on one person to educate the public about what we need. It's not going to work.
We got one up right now. If I go forward, will that work? Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So then, Amanda, can you do that without that screen?
I
in front of you?
can.
All
Yep,
right.
I got it.
All right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
You want to forward? Can you see that from there?
Yes.
Approximately?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm Amanda Carr with Clocher & Carr. I'm an attorney based in Seattle, Washington. We also have an office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I've been working with shellfish farmers since 2006. So I tried to go back and think about a few examples from Washington State that have sort of stood the test of time. They happened kind of in my first 5 years of practice, kind of worked with them and have come up over and over again as being really helpful. The first slide I have here is language that I have taken from Washington's Shoreline Management Act guidelines. So these are regulations that the Department of Ecology puts together that direct local governments in developing their land use plans for shoreline areas. And everybody pretty much in the shoreline has to get some form of permit. So it's a lot of kind of use conflict issues come up, environmental issues, et cetera. And there is really great language in the regulations for shellfish aquaculture. And it's really come in handy. So hopefully folks can read the language on the screen, but I'll just kind of tick through some of the things it says. One is that aquaculture is an activity of statewide interest. So that really elevates its significance. It talks about the environmental benefits, the fact that it's a water dependent use, which is important in Washington's framework. And believe it or not, we've actually had to make the case that aquaculture is a water dependent use. It seems kind of self-evident, but people want to put it in buildings upland. And then also just this last language, you can't just farm anywhere. You really need certain conditions. And that's something that I think growers know really well. But when you're in a NIMBY context and somebody wants you to just go over there, it helps to make the case that you can't just farm in any location. And then also just techniques change. Even in Washington, where farming's been happening for a long time, recognizing that you shouldn't be too prescriptive when you're putting these regulations together, and let growers develop their techniques and respond to market needs. And that was great for the county developing their land use plans. It was very helpful in that context. It's been helpful in many other contexts too. We have put these in comment letters, this language. We've put it in legal briefs. Judges have put it in decisions, then it just really elevates this language. So that's been something that's been very helpful. The second example is the Washington Shellfish Initiative, which I think folks may be familiar with. This is back in 2011. And it really broader than shellfish farming, but definitely about shellfish farming, and really carried the message of shellfish being important to the state, economy, environmental benefits, the culture. It came out of a federal initiative. So there was a kind of a federal state partnership there. One thing that was really valuable was who is delivering that message. And so this was an initiative led by then Governor Chris Gregoire. And you can kind of see the media coverage of it here was really, really great. But this is NOAA Director Jane Lubchenco, Christine Gregoire, the governor, Billy Frank of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, who is a really important tribal leader, and then Bill Dewey from Taylor Shellfish, who's here. This is at the Taylor facility here, so part of the launch. And having those voices just elevate that message was really, really critical. That initiative also funded some research through Sea Grant that helped answer some questions that had been raised in the permitting context, brought a lot of great resources in for ocean acidification, which I think was really beneficial to protecting and encouraging the growth of shellfish farming. And that's something, the initiative we've used everywhere. Growers can go to DC and talk about it. It's in all the comment letters and in the briefs and things like that. And then just this last example, this kind of, I think there's a good mantra or strategy of setting good precedent. So if you have something that comes up and it's going to affect a lot of growers, kind of come together, develop a strategy, put some extra energy and resources toward it. This is one that came up in 2007. Some NIMBYs wanted to, they got a legislator to ask the attorney general if growers needed one particular kind of permit. And rather than sort of letting the attorney general figure that out, we wrote a letter and said, this is how we see that analysis. We don't think a permit's necessary. The attorney general agreed with us and issued the decision, and then growers have not needed that particular permit in Washington. And then lastly, I'll just mention, I did a evaluation of regulations and regulatory constraints back in 2019 through the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission with an attorney, Larry Marino, in Louisiana. We now have Megan Terrell, an attorney down in Louisiana in an office there, but this is before she joined. And we looked at, there's a report and a presentation that was done looking at all the regulations in the Gulf states and trying to identify some of the chutes and ladders. It's still out there. I think it'd be really interesting for someone to do another one. This was a long time ago, kind of, we were looking in 2018, but for someone to kind of take this on more broadly. And we did identify some as part of that good policy statements that we thought were particularly helpful, both from the Gulf and other areas.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Keith Butterfield. I own a small oyster farm. I land about 500,000 oysters a year up in the great state of Maine. And, Maine has a lot of room for improvement in their aquaculture permitting process. I'm wondering, are there any government officials in the room that manage aquaculture programs? So I think that's problem number one. It would be great, if we all reached out to our aquaculture directors and let them know about these conferences and encourage them to come here. This would be fantastic for them to get together. For example, in Florida, because I also am a distributor of the flip farm stuff, I see a lot of farms. And there are a lot of different states that do things really well. One thing that Florida does well is they set your corner markers for you. It may sound little. Well, they do in parts of Florida. And they should everywhere. They should set your corner buoys for you so you know the four corners of your farm. I just had an incident in Maine where my farm's been in place for over 3 years, and they sent out an inspector who thought one of my corner buoys was out of place. Well, 3 years down the road isn't when you tell me you think my corner buoy's out of place. But some of the things that Maine does well that I'd like to share with you all that you might want to, let your directors know is the permitting process has 3 potential permits. One is an LPA, a limited purpose application. And so it's just 400 square feet of water column. So if you had, an oyster grow cage that's 4 feet wide, it's going to be about 100-foot long string line that you can use, and you can go out and test a site. It's a very quick approval process. You can renew it yearly, and you can test a site really quickly and easily, and you can find out whether the public is okay with you being in that spot, whether your oysters grow well there, what the weather's like. So it's a fantastic way to get into farming without going through a 5-year permitting process, which is what it took me to get a standard lease, which can be up to 20 years. And then they slide this other lease in between that you may or may not choose to use. It has been valuable. It's a little bit faster to get than a standard lease. You don't have to go through a public hearing, which is really nice. And that is a 3-year lease that's not renewable. So the concept is go out with your LPA, find a good spot, put in for a 3-year experimental lease that will be quicker to get approved. And then if it goes well, and once you're there, you're almost a shoe-in. You'd have to have done something poorly out there and tick people off to not get the standard lease. So I think that process is really good, and that LPA is something that others might want to emulate. Something we also see from our Department of Marine Resources, and that's our primary contact. We don't have lots of approvals to get. We go to DMR. This is really well streamlined there. They need more people to process them more quickly, but it's DMR, and then it's a sign-off by the Army Corps of Engineers. And the Army Corps in Maine is super fast and easy. It's literally a phone call, and they'll have it turned around for you in 24, 48 hours. They're just fantastic. And that's not the case in other states. I've heard Georgia's a nightmare. But in the state of Maine, yeah, DMR is your primary contact. Something that I love that they do is that they have somebody that goes out to the farms. If you want to be a dealer, take it then to the next step so that you can sell directly into restaurants. You want to be a dealer, they have a very consultative approach. And so they have someone dedicated for this process. You have to have a person, and this person goes out to the farm and literally helps strategize on what you'd need to build and do, the sinks, the coolers, the things that you'd need in order to become a dealer. And they're with you through that whole process. So they do that it's fantastic. They don't do that when it comes to farming. When it comes to farming, you're on your own, and they're not consultative like that. I think they could learn from that part of their program and be more consultative and cooperative out on the water rather than punitive to get people in compliance. And they'd find, in the defense of regulators in the state of Maine, they've been, traditionally working with commercial fishermen, right? And the commercial fisheries haven't been the greatest stewards of our bays, let's be honest. They've been difficult. So it's a different class of, a different type of people, an eclectic group of people that are environmentalists at heart that they're dealing with now, and they just haven't quite gotten there and understood they're dealing with people that want to do right by the environment. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that Maine does a good job of making sure there aren't poachers out there for, I don't mean stealing product, I mean poaching water. I think this is really important, and states need to shore this up. Just in my recent conversations with Aaron Pannell, who's from New Zealand, Aaron was explaining his costs. I wanted to understand what his cost structure looked like, what his operating costs were per oyster. We have very similar costs. It's almost 2/3 or more labor, but there's this other cost that he had that I was just shocked to hear about. People in New Zealand sublease water. They lock it up. They're not the farmers. And then they go out and sell it on the open market. He's paying like $1,500 a string line. Can you imagine adding that cost to your farm right now? That's outrageous. They're delivering no value, and they're siphoning out of that industry. We need to make sure that doesn't happen, because as we mature, the water's going to go away. There will not be more water. And those who have water should be farmers and not financial institutions subleasing them out. In the state of Maine, you cannot sublease a lease. They're ahead of the curve in Maine. They're on top of that one. Another one, with regard to the LPAs, they learned some tough lessons. You can only have 4 LPAs under your name, right? The point is not to put out 50 LPAs because you can get them approved quickly, right? So imagine, right? You're thinking, well, I could wait 5 years, or I could put in for 50 LPAs. And that's not the purpose of the LPA, and people started abusing it. So they said you can only do 4 LPAs per person. And then they realized, oh, everybody's cousin, mother, brother, and sister's getting LPAs from that family, but there's only one person working them. So now they've restricted that to, if you're putting in for an LPA, you're the person working the farm, full stop. No one's allowed to work on that LPA without you there. And that took care of that problem. I think it's a really good program that's worth sharing. One of the things that I'd like to see the great state of Maine do that I see in other states is planning and mapping and setting up aquaculture zones. They've chosen not to do that. Firstly, I'm sure because of the resources, the limitations on their resources. That takes a lot of time and effort. It's not easy to do. It's hard. That's really hard work. You might know we are loaded with lobstermen, right? You can't drive across our bay without, dodging lobster traps. So these are lobstermen who have been lobstering for generations. And if you know anything about lobstering, that generation lobsters that area and don't mess with their area. Other lobstermen don't mess with it. It's very territorial. So the state doesn't want to mess with it. So what they do is they say, yeah, go try to find yourself a spot out there and hey, good luck. And, we'll let you know after you apply for it, whether we're going to give it to you or not. And then you fight it out in the public forum. There's some good in that and there's some bad because you get buy-in. You have to work with people. You have to go talk to the lobstermen. That's good. That's all good stuff. But what's bad is they don't know where their aquaculture is going to go. They don't know how much they're going to have. They can't plan. So our economic development, community development for the state of Maine can't come to the table and say, oh, that's how many hectares of, area that you're going to be. And this is how many oysters you can produce per hectare. So this is the revenue opportunity. Okay, now I can invest in it as a state. So you just miss out on so much when you don't do that planning. So I personally think that we should have all aquaculture directors in the same room to talk about with farmers. We ought to do a survey and say, what are your top 2 or 3 things that you like best about the policies in your state? And then let's share it with our aquaculture directors. And then let's get NOAA in the room because they need to be helping to coordinate from a federal level so that there are some standards. And some of those standards should be, you need a plan, you need a map, maybe you need to set corner buoys so it's clearly marked in the right location for the farmer. There could be some standardization to it nationally is my point. So that's what I'd like to see.
All right. So what we want to do now with the time, and we called it Chutes and Ladders, and I did ask the panelists, I'm like, could we focus on the ladders? Because I think it would be easy to spend more than 45 minutes talking about all the hurdles, the chutes that people have had. But I certainly want people in the audience, like if you think about, do you have any questions for your panelists here or any thoughts about things that are particularly useful in your state that have helped the industry either grow or have been just stops for your industry?
Just like to respond, our aquaculture, the guy that's over the Jason Ryder, he is attending the conference. He's not in the room right now, but he's been a very big supporter of ours, and he's got everything off and running. And he's just one guy we can go to, we can get answers, and we can move ahead with our business. So I just want to shout out him because you hear that.
And I will say that from an Oyster South perspective, we've always encouraged that, but it is a fairly also industry-friendly meeting, and I'm not sure that it would also change potentially the vibe of the meeting if you had a lot of regulators in the room. And so I'm not saying that that's not a good thing to do, but I just also don't, we just haven't, the invite's always been open. We don't see a lot of regulators show up. So maybe it should be a deliberate invite.
Yeah, so one of the things that Alabama has done is that you can grow under your peer in that footprint without a Corps of Engineer, a nationwide 48. You just have to get it approved through the Marine Resources and the Department of Health if you grow in that footprint. And there's in coastal Alabama and probably in a lot of places, people have piers that sometimes are 500-600 foot long. So you can grow tens of thousands of oysters in that, and you can get that almost immediately. And what I'd like to be able to do is to, tie my shell elevators next to the pier as a boat. So I could, grow the entire water column, but not present a hazard to marine traffic. It would have a 360-degree stern light on it at nighttime. But to grow in the shadow of that pier, much as you would if you were, mooring a vessel next to it. I'm just wondering what anybody thinks about that. A vessel could be no infrastructure other than an anchor. And now you're not really doing a permanent, like putting in pilings or anything. You have a vessel basically that would be under the Coast Guard.
Any of your states have something like that?
North Carolina, we can do that. You're limited to having a pier on the water. You got to get a CAMA permit to do that. Like my shop has a dilapidated pier. I wouldn't walk on it. It's more to just toss out some bushels of dead oysters back out into the water. I would not put oysters there. And it's really close to shrimp boats that dump oil in the water. So it wouldn't be feasible for us. But I could see where someone that does have the land close to the water with a pier, that would be a great way to start out. But our piers, we don't have 500-foot piers. Oh, yeah, I'm right there at North Topsail.
Then in the same area, most of these piers go out like less than 100 foot and have a split. But in that area from the shoreline to the end of the pier, you could grow oysters there. Obviously, you can grow them. Seems like that would allow people to participate.
I submitted that to the state, that idea. I think it's a great public relations opportunity, frankly. If you can get the landowners along our seashore to put in a few cages in front, that maybe it's just for fun, I think they're going to be more amenable to the industry as a whole.
There's about a half dozen farms that are pier-based now.
All right. I know we got another question over here.
So, had a question addressing some other shoots. Do any of your states have programs that might help farmers with the initial investment in farms and also risk management tools for farms?
No. No, but I know actually the state of Maryland, I know Bill referenced it, Marbidco, does some low interest loans for starting farmers. Does North Carolina have anything like that?
I didn't use any loans. I used credit cards. Got all that paid off. I bought a lot of stuff during COVID. When we have that 18-inch off the bottom approval. So I bought every broken oyster grow cage I could find with no pontoons on it and just sank them to the bottom. So I had them off the bottom, but barely off the bottom. Now I have SEPA and I didn't use anything for starting up for that, but for risk management, I don't know if it's state specific, the NAP and ELAP insurance plans, and they are very helpful. And I mean, you're not going to sell crop that year, but they'll at least give you the money you need to buy more seed for the next year and maybe a little bit extra so that you aren't starving. So there is some insurance policies. I think Farm Bureau has another great one, but you have to be in business for X amount of years for that one to even, I think it's 4 years for Farm Bureau. So that does help with risk management.
Water calls is $35 per acre per quarter acre per year, $10 per property. Yeah, I mean, my farm is just under 7 acres and it's under $400.
I'm going to build off what the Florida folks said. I'm Adrienne Johnson. I'm the director of the Florida Shellfish Aquaculture Association. So I appreciate all the shout outs to associations, both national and state. I do think it's the role of the association to help farmers advocate, well, both advocate and navigate policy. And I think one of the things, maybe not specific policy, but just on process, this is the second year we've done a lobby day at the Capitol. So we take our farmers, both clam and oyster farmers, to the state Capitol, talk with our lawmakers. I think one of the things we've seen is that on the education side, a lot of folks that are making decisions about policy that impact our farms don't have a lot of the baseline knowledge. And so trying to be proactive at the front end, saying, you know, think of us as thought partners and resources when you are making decisions that affect shellfish aquaculture has been helpful. We're still, you know, building those relationships, but I'm curious if you all have other proactive ideas of just how to do that education on the front end. So you're helping shape policy in real time instead of reacting to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would like to just echo that general sentiment that like state level industry trade groups, nationwide industry trade groups are really important. You know, the only levers we have to pull to affect the regulations we operate under are, you know, is discussion with our elected officials. So being able to operate on a state level to do that and have ongoing relationships back and forth with everybody who has a stake in it, I think that's crucial. And likewise on a you know a national level as well.
Yeah, I just add to that. I think developing those relationships with regulators and with legislators at the state and federal level. So you have that relationship and you can build that foundation before there's an issue that you need to be, you know, sitting down and talking to somebody about is really effective. And PCSGA, ECSGA, you know, have sort of a framework in place. They've been doing that for a long time. And I think it's proved to be really effective.
Yeah, I'll just add before Bill goes, like Oyster South encourages members to join their state association, their regional associations, because there's also a Gulf Shellfish Farmers Association now, and the National Association. And I know that's a lot of memberships, but there are problems, there are things to address at each of those levels, and they all need your participation. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just continuing on the theme of supporting your growers associations, but also just individually, you have responsibilities as growers to get involved in those policy discussions and the rulemaking. I was reminded of that with Amanda's first slide with the Shoreline Management Act in Washington State. That favorable language about the water dependent use and the ability to have flexibility. That was a direct result of one of Taylor's employees participating in a rulemaking update that got that language in that we've been able to rely on ever since. So there's a lot of value to that. Another one that hasn't been mentioned, you know, is making sure you're supporting elected officials that are going to support your industry. So we get involved in a lot of campaign events and so on to support politicians, you know, support industry.
And Bill, you'd encourage them to invite people out to your farm. I mean, I think one of the things here is getting people familiar with the industry. And so having them come out to the farm and eat some oysters is not a bad idea. Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Can I jump in, Bill?
Yeah, please.
I wanted to maybe start an argument with Keith about free-zoned aquaculture areas. And I know it sounded like in Maine, maybe there's some reasons for that being a good thing. In Virginia, in 2011, there was an effort to set aside, quote, aquaculture opportunity zones. And, you know, fortunately, that did not get passed into law in Virginia, and currently the entire state of Virginia is an aquaculture opportunity zone. So I do think, you know, fencing in growth of the industry, you know, it may be applicable in certain states and certain areas, but if I were a grower and that was being, you know, in a state where that was being suggested, I would be looking at it suspiciously.
And I'll also say, to give it perspective from some other states, I think spatial planning, when you're zoning things and saying this zone can be used for this, that can't, that scares a lot of people because typically that's been, you can only do shellfish aquaculture over here and it's usually not a great spot. Versus these ideas of aquaculture like Wood's presentation with aquaculture parks, that doesn't mean you can't do aquaculture somewhere else. It's just saying, we know this area works and we will promote this as an area for people to work together. So those are slightly different
Like,
concepts.
yeah, like
Just-
pre-zoned,
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that did make sense to me. And it lowers the bar of entry too, which is a good thing.
Exactly, exactly. So we have this industry that we're trying to get started. And if it takes 5 years to get a lease, then it's not going to get started very fast. So the bears in the details. I'd say roughly half of the people that I talk to about this have the same response as you, Chris. And they're like, nope, I don't want the state telling me where I can't and can't go. But I would definitely view it more like your viewpoint, Bill, when I'd say these are zones that are pre-approved and there's a fast track for these zones. If you want to go outside of these zones, then you're going to apply and go through this long process that may be a no.
Functionally, though, that may end up, forcing people into an area. But we could go back and forth all day.
Well, today we have lunch on your own, so I want to make sure we have time because Paul Zajac is going to talk from National Aquaculture Association at 1:30 about some of these important issues at the national level. So I want to give you time to come back for that. But can we thank the panelists for sharing their information? Thank you all.